Welcome to Spilled Ink.
Welcome to another episode of Spilled Ink. Again, continue to just go back into the archives of people I've known for a long, long time. And joining me today is Tom Glasgow, who's been a sports broadcaster here for pretty much as long as I've been around. In fact, to kick things off here, I think I was we first met when my dad and Laura Vesey were on a show, and you were the moderator, I believe. And I would think I was in high school, and it was cool for me just to get to go see behind the scenes, at a show like that. And I love sports even back then. And I always appreciated the kindness that you showed me then. So welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, that was back on what is now Root Sports. At that time, Mason, it was Fox Sports Net Northwest, like the longest ever name for a regional network. But yeah, your dad, Laura Vesey, John McGrath from the News Tribune in Tacoma was a regular on that show. But yeah, we had a great time. We're just like, some friends getting together to yak about sports a little bit. And I've been around long enough. Actually, the first event I covered were some exciting dinosaur races. So it's been a while.
And the cool thing about that is you look at the progression of media today, and what I appreciated about that show was it was a discussion about sports. It wasn't the screaming, first take situation that, it was like a local version of the old sports reporter show on ESPN where, it was like rational conversation.
That's really what it was modeled after, because I really enjoyed that show. Now, the only thing I didn't like about it was all national topics, and they weren't, for obvious reason, weren't talking about the teams and the events that I cared about most and that the audience cared about most. It was hard to match that crew, but I think we did a nice job in terms of talking Seattle sports and then broadening out, getting down into Oregon, anything regionally, and we tap into national as well. But I enjoyed it. I wish there was something still like that going on now. Maybe it will. Somebody else will get it going at some point. But it was a fun project.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I feel like all the different places that we've run into each other over the years, if there's a job in broadcasting, you've probably had it. Kind of walk me through, your journey and, how you see this evolving media landscape from someone who's been doing it, pre-Twitter.
Yeah. So let me start with the back end of that first. In terms of, I think, where media is and where it's going, generally speaking, whether it's broadcast, radio and TV, print. I think the traditional outlets you've seen kind of go from this, right? A pretty big slice of the pie, and then everything's contracting. There are fewer people, there are fewer opportunities, the salary is decreasing, but the workload is increasing. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to get more out of fewer people while paying them less money. So, I get kids in college who reach out to me fairly often seeking advice. And the first thing I tell them is you better be really passionate about it. And if you're getting into it because you think by being on TV or being on the radio, you're going to get into some serious coin, you could be one of those 1%ers, but the bulk of people, are grinding it out like everybody else. So to touch on the social media stuff, I'm not going to tell you I'm an expert where the streaming world is going. And I know there are many more opportunities out there. But I'll leave that expertise up to other people. I just don't have it. In terms of how I got to where I am, born and raised in Tacoma, Mount Tacoma High School, PLU. My last semester of my senior year, I interviewed for an internship at Cairo Radio and TV. Somehow landed it. My first boss in that unpaid role was a guy by the name of Pete Gross, and Pete was the original voice of the Seahawks. I'm trying to condense all this because, again, it's like a book. But as my internship was ending, they were creating a job for a radio sports producer, primarily to serve one Wayne Cody. If people are old enough, they would remember Wayne. He was a real force in the media, both on radio and TV. So I was offered that job, and I was kind of off and running. 14 years, 81 to 95, I was at Cairo Radio, transitioned to the TV side. After that, I bounced over to Fox Sports Net Northwest. And then from there, I went over to Como Radio and spent 16 years there. I want to say 02, 03 to like 19, right? And then let me backtrack a bit. While I was doing that with Como, I re-engaged as a freelancer at what is now Root Sports. So I was doing various play-by-play events for them, pre and post-game show hosting. You're right to the extent of, I thought about this the other day. I'm nearing the end of my 44th year in the market, right? And I've really had a role, a broadcast role with almost every franchise. I'm probably the only, I think I am, I can safely say, I'm the only person on the planet who did broadcasting for both Seattle Reign teams, the basketball Seattle Reign from the American Basketball League and the existing Seattle Reign of the National Women's Soccer League. But Seahawks, Husky Sports, Mariners, Sonics, my number one passion, all kinds of stuff. So I've been really blessed to be exposed to a lot of different people, a lot of different formats. It's been a terrific run.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, seeing teams come and go, I've seen you on Kraken broadcasts.
Yeah.
Obviously it's still devastating to not have the Sonics in town. Is there a team that, while us working in the media business that we tend to be, objective as much as possible,
Yeah.
is there a team that you've really appreciated more than someone that's been really special to you?
Sure. Well, 79 Sonics. I mean, if you can imagine, this little kid in Tacoma, Washington, get home from school, sit on the front porch, waiting for the Tacoma News Tribune to be delivered in the afternoon, so I could go right to the sports section. And first and foremost, regardless of the time of year, even if it was out of season, see if there was any news about the Supersonics. I remember the day that Lenny Wilkens was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers. It was devastating. This community was in outrage. There was a stronger reaction to that than Trump's tariffs. I mean, we were furious about this. So I've been passionate about the Sonics my entire life. So when that team made that run to the title in 79, man, it was just a dream come true. I remember exactly where I was. I remember exactly what I did right after they won the title. Unfortunately, I was in Tacoma and not up at the big party here. I did come to the championship parade celebration. I climbed up in a tree,
Oh, wow.
so I could get a better view. Walking back to my car, I remember seeing DJ drive by in his big, I think it was a big Cadillac convertible, waving at DJ. I was just a knucklehead college guy, sleeping overnight at the Kingdome to get tickets to the finals. It was a blast. It was a blast. So first and foremost, passionate about the Sonics, that team in particular. And then just literally a few years later, I mean, I'm in the locker room interviewing a bunch of those guys, getting audio for Wayne Cody's afternoon sports and Pete Gross's morning sports. So, and then eventually, a little later into my Cairo stint, Bob Blackburn came on board when we picked up the broadcast rights to the Sonics. And I mean, I used to have a little realistic radio with that plug-in, that one thing that went into your ear, listening to Bob do play-by-play from, all over the NBA. So, and I'll keep going on this. When I was about 15, I went to the Lenny Wilkens John Trezvant basketball camp, which was held in Issaquah. So at that time, going from Tacoma to Issaquah, I might as well have gone from like Tacoma to Nova Scotia. It just felt like it was such a long way away. And then fast forward, I don't know, X amount of years, 20 years, 25 maybe. I'm working on television with Lenny Wilkens. I'm doing play-by-play. Lenny's my analyst. we did a lot of Seattle U games. We did some UW games. So that phrase "dream come true."
Mhm.
I've had a lot of dreams come true from this little kid in Tacoma. Things I wanted to accomplish, and I think in many respects I kind of exceeded those.
Mhm. Well, it's interesting to hear you say all that because I see so many parallels. Speaking of being from Tacoma, I went to Steilacoom High School, so
Yeah.
definitely in that area. In fact, I used to deliver the News Tribune when I was in high school, so
Nice.
it's weird to think about that, right? That like
Yeah.
80% of my neighborhood got the newspaper, and I
Yeah.
would I worked basically for tips, right? People would pay for their papers and then whatever extra was kind of what I made. And for me, I think that team was the '95 Mariners.
Yeah.
I remember sitting in the outfield in the Kingdom, when Edgar hit the double. And so that's the kind of moment that I'll never forget. And so it's cool, like
Yeah.
hearing say that and how important uh, local sports have been to both of us.
Yeah.
The one thing
Here we are
I
30
will say,
years
and I'm,
later, right?
what's
30
that?
years, we're 30th anniversary of that 95 team, right? 95 to 2025. Help me on my math.
Oh
Isn't it
yeah, right,
close?
right.
So, a quick story about that,
Yeah.
Mason. So, at that time, I was between jobs. I did not have a contract renewed at Cairo, and this was before I started at Root. So, I was at that game as a fan. I wasn't working, and I was sitting down the third base line, probably 50 feet beyond third base. So, when Edgar rips that ball, I had a great view of it, and it was kind of interesting because I was torn in that it was great to experience that moment as a pure fan,
Mhm.
but at the same time I was like, damn, I can't follow it, I can't report on it, because I was in this interim phase. So anyway, yeah, memorable day for a lot of reasons for me.
Is it, and hearing you say that because, again, I remember going when Tim Court was the AP sports reporter
Yeah.
locally. I was in college and I would run quotes for him. So typically in the Sonics locker room. One time though, I'm a huge Indiana Pacers fan, and so he sent me into the Pacers locker room, and I'm standing there waiting to talk to Reggie. He's the reason why I became a Pacer fan, and I was sort of the next question up, right? Like I let all
Mhm.
the people that needed to get stuff, and then I was about to ask my question. He's like, "That's it." And for me, I found myself sort of what you were talking about being a fan and wanting to work these games, and you're kind of it's not glamorous, right? Like in a lot of ways because you get to see some cool stuff, and also you're there to do a job where with people who don't always want you there.
That's a great point. I kind of felt that way every time the Lakers were in town and I had to go into their locker room and approach Kareem, right? At that time, he's a fascinating story to me because I would say Kareem was not, during his playing career, generally speaking, media friendly.
Hmm.
And yet I find him now to be one of the most open, engaging, interesting people when he talks. But man, to me, he was very intimidating at that time. And there were others. I mean, one of the things you have to have, and you develop, I think, pretty quickly, is a feel for the room. Who can I approach? When can I approach? And how do I approach them? I'll use another Lakers example for that real quick. For folks that remember, there was a time, and if you watch that Showtime
Oh,
thing
hmm.
on the Lakers, I forget exactly what it was called.
Yeah, wasn't it? It was called Showtime, but it was on HBO. So,
Yeah, it
right,
wasn't a
yeah,
documentary,
yeah.
right? But when Magic got Westhead, I think it was fired. He was a villain around the country, and they came to Seattle for the first time after all this went down, and he was booed relentlessly. And so now I want to go talk to Magic. So I go into the locker room. I think the Lakers had lost the game. He'd been booed. I'm like, how am I going to get a connection with him when he's had this, shitty night.
Hmm.
And I got to take a sympathetic tone with him. So he's sitting down. I get on one knee, so we're at eye level. I said, man, I said, Magic, I go, for someone who's been so loved for so long, getting booed like you were booed here tonight around the country, that's got to be really tough. So I took that tone and he opened up, right?
Hmm.
So I don't know. Locker rooms are interesting. I remember going into the Sonics locker room after they lost that Game 5 to the Denver Nuggets, blowing a 2-0 lead in that best-of-5 series. That was a rough locker room. Uh, After the Seahawks bungled the end of Super Bowl 48,
Hmm.
brutal. I mean, brutal. You feel for those guys because you know how much work they put into it. We all knew that call was going to be controversial. So fascinating and brutal at this at the
Hmm.
same time.
Is there, and I've always found it interesting that it really depends on the locker rooms kind of go by sport, right? Like I never felt comfortable in the Mariners clubhouse because I felt like if you're not there every day, then they don't really want you around, except for when Griffey was making fun of me because of my dad. It's the only time I actually didn't feel like I didn't belong in there. NBA locker rooms, I think are uh, it really kind of goes. I think they're more welcoming typically.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I'll never forget. I was in there one day when Brent Barry was playing, and somebody asked him a question. Oh, hey Brent, you've been struggling with your shot lately, and he replied, and I wish I had the audio for a long time. I wish I still had it. It was like, well, you've been struggling with your questions lately, and I don't point that out. And so there
He was
was
great,
that.
by the way.
What's that?
He was one of the best. That Sonics era, but like George Carl was phenomenal. I can remember after Sonic practices, a bunch of us, including your dad, just sitting along and listening to George riff on stuff.
Hmm.
Just talking. But Brent was excellent. He was really fun to be around.
Hmm. Yeah, I think oh, and I guess kind of going back to what we were saying is that I've really found for me like Washington's locker room when we were doing those interviews, that was great for me because I'd known all those kids since they were
Yeah.
15. And it really a locker, I think most people don't, because they don't get to experience, they don't know the difference between, like everyone's like, oh, I would love to do your job, right? Or would love to have these opportunities. And it's really, there's so much work on the front end to get to know these people so that
Hmm.
you can't just go in there and be like, oh, I'm so happy to see you.
Yeah. I would agree with you. You know how you were kind of ranking the locker rooms. MLB generally has been over the years that can be a very difficult environment, especially to your point. If the Mariners have seen you around for fairly regularly, you maybe have a little credibility with them. They at least know who you are. But you go walking into the opposing locker rooms and they don't know you from Jack.
Hmm.
They can make your life really difficult.
Hmm.
So again, that's a broad blanket. There are always some guys that are spectacular, um, but some who can be really difficult. But again, generally speaking, yeah, I'd probably go. I don't know. I'd go NBA, NFL, pretty comparable.
Hmm.
Baseball a little more challenging. College kids are usually they're just happy that someone kind of wants to talk to them.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's interesting. And locker rooms are not the most enjoyable environments to necessarily
No,
be in,
no.
especially when you're working on the TV side. You have to. Oh, there's a person we need to interview, but we should probably let him get his clothes on first, right?
Mhm.
So you just have to work it and figure it out.
Speaking of athletes and not having any clothes on, I'll never forget going into the Sonics locker rooms, and I was always like, why are the towels so small? Uh, Number one, and then number two, I distinctly remember Jerome James, right? Like you'd walk in the locker room, and his locker was like you first one you'd see, and he was always just sitting there, like just totally naked, and I'm like,
He's very
oh.
very comfortable. He's just very comfortable.
And I'm like, are you that comfortable or are you just making us uncomfortable? Because it feels like that
Well,
that's
I will tell you there, kind of serious along those lines. I really felt, I mean, it was really tough for female reporters if you had situations like that. And
Hmm.
I felt for them. They deserve access just as much as we do. I kind of felt there were, I'm sure, times where guys went out of their way to make them feel uncomfortable.
Hmm.
So props to all of those gals, especially 30 years ago, 35 years ago, when these barriers were coming down and access was being gained. They had to fight for that,
Hmm.
and I think it's fair to say weren't always welcomed with open arms.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the reason why that Jerome James thing sticks with me is because Elise was always in those locker rooms, right?
Yeah,
And that was I was sort of like, oh man, like I am uncomfortable. I can only imagine,
yeah,
and you know,
yeah,
credit to just go in and do your job, and
yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
ultimately, like that's what we're all doing. So changing directions just a little bit.
Sure.
One of the reasons why I wanted to contact you about doing the podcast is that, we've wrapped up the state tournament last month, and I don't know why, but I went back and watched the '98 Rainier Beach State Championship game. I found it on YouTube, and who's on the call? You're there. You are,
Yeah,
and it was so cool how things used to be that, big network, Kingdom, and for some reason the kids looked more mature, like for some
yeah,
everything, it was just such a cool experience, right? And to have all those guys, Jamal Crawford,
yeah.
Will Conroy was like a freshman on that team. Big Dave King was super fun to watch. What do you remember about that, about doing those games and that
Yeah.
team? And
Well, whether it was the high school championship game, I know we did some high school championship football games as well. Um, Look, if you were ever a high school athlete, and I played basketball, you know, um, you and didn't get to a state championship game, um, you can appreciate how big this was for those kids. I mean, it was their Super Bowl, it was their NBA Finals. For most of those kids, that game that we broadcast was going to be the only time in their lives they were going to be on television in their sport, right?
Mhm.
And so we all took it really seriously. I mean, our people behind the scenes, producers, directors, camera, audio. I mean, we put the same effort into that as we would put into a then Pac-10 athletic event or a professional event. It was the same people with the same dedication, wanting to make that as big time as possible. For me, it's interesting, Mason. Those were they're the hardest games to prepare for because you don't have the information at hand,
Mhm.
especially back then,
Mhm.
that you would get covering the Huskies, Seahawks, whatever, right? That information's easy. Pronunciation guides are there. You can listen to other games and make sure you're saying a kid's name correctly. At the high school level, it's the preparation is much more labor intensive, but really important because of that thing I mentioned that for most of these kids, it was the only time that they were going to have something that 20, 30, 50 years down the road they could watch.
Mhm.
You wanted to make sure you got everything, especially their names, correct.
Mhm.
That was really important to me because I knew it would be really important to them. But once the game started, you just call in another game.
Mhm.
So whether it was the boys' title game or the girls' title game, um, it was fun. I wish that was still there, whether it was on Root or any of the other stations in town, because I think it's so cool for the kids to kind of have that moment. So look, it's not dead and buried that that'll never happen again. I know a lot of that stuff's available on streaming, but it's still not as cool. I don't think it's as cool.
I mean that's, honestly, that's the reason why we're sitting here right now is because of that, right? I mean, being at the Tacoma Dome, all the games were being streamed somewhere. It's just, and in some ways it's great because, family and and they get to see all of it, and it's still a special thing. I just think that there has been something truly special about those opportunities. And and I've said this I told the story a lot. I was at the state football semifinals this year, and I was talking to Todd Millis, former News Tribune writer, who actually he makes him feel old when I say this, but he covered me, when I was a quarterback at Stillicum. And I was like, "Hey, where's the Times?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, they're not here." And they were at the
Yeah.
title game. But as someone who has done that job, to not have somebody at the 3A state semifinals in football was that day. I was like, "Okay, I can't do much. I'm only one person, but I'm gonna do something."
Well, look, and that's a really important point, and it gets back to the thing I was talking about early on was this contraction that's taking place. Well, when that contraction takes place, what pays the price? And that's usually your local, your high school, your Olympic style sports that don't normally get the type of attention. There are great stories out there, but you have to have people who can cover them, right? I don't know. I get maybe Instagram and TikTok and X kind of fill that void because people can put their own content out there. But again, I don't think it's the same. I'll give a shout out right here to King Five in Seattle. They do a great job on Friday nights with their high school football coverage. They do a really good job with their high school basketball coverage. So kudos to them. The other TV stations in town, frankly, don't give a rip about sports.
Mhm.
Channel 7, Cairo doesn't even really have a dedicated sports person. Como has a one person staff, and Nico does the best he can. But when I first came into the market, right at Cairo TV at the time, you had Wayne Cody was the primary anchor. A guy named Gary Spinell was the weekend anchor who also reported during the week, and another guy by the name of Ron Callen was a dedicated reporter. And they had like two full time photographers,
Mhm.
like five people. That's unheard of.
Yeah.
Channel 13's got a pretty good staff. I know there are three on air people at King, really dedicated to what they do. But generally speaking, um, man, it's not what it used to be in terms of local sports coverage. So again, and this has a lot to do with the business model now, how many people are peeling off of. We got these things, right? I don't have to wait for the 5 o'clock news, the 6 o'clock news, or the 11 to find out who won, what the weather's going to be like, what the news is. So they're losing a lot of viewers.
Mhm.
And so you cut budgets. Well, where do you cut? Well, you start with the last thing you air in your show, and that's sports.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox on that.
I mean, I'm right there with you. I think I'm in some ways, things have worked out for me a little bit in that I left for a while and was like, oh, I miss this too much to not do it, and also realized that I don't need to do it in a traditional way, right?
Yeah.
And so to your point earlier, I mean, when I was at the Times, I was covering a game, and there was this thing called Cover It Live back then, which was
Mhm.
just typing, right? Like, so, it was like you'd put it in a blog and then you'd type and it would appear in real time. And so I was doing play-by-play during football games, like at Pop Keeney Stadium, doing that, doing Twitter, writing a story. And so now what I'm doing today feels like such a lighter lift,
Yeah.
even though I am taking the photos and writing the stories. Um, but I love it. And it's funny. I was joking with Dick Fain at the state tournament. I said, I was like, yeah, I'm pretty much doing the same job, except I'm not getting paid for it yet. Like, well, you weren't really getting paid for it at the Times either. So
It's true.
yeah.
Look, it's a completely different situation, but I think you're much more ahead of the curve. Look, my career is much closer to the end than the beginning. So, and for me, that's a good thing, and probably for the general public, it's a good thing too. But anyway, that being said, um, kudos to you for finding the way and finding your lane. I'll tell you a funny story. The first time I was professionally on the radio, there was a small radio station in Tacoma, and they basically hired students from the high schools to do little 30-second updates from their high school games. So what I would do, they'd assign me a game. I think I was actually early on at PLU,
Mhm.
and just out of Mount Tahoma, but they would usually assign me games at Lincoln Bowl, so Tacoma City League at the time.
Mhm.
And so at the end of each quarter, I'd call in a little report like, Mount Tahoma leads Lincoln 6-0. Mike Vindovich with a 27-yard touchdown run, 13, and then they'd record it and you'd hang up, and then you'd run to your car and you turn on the radio so you could hear them play that back, so you could hear yourself
Oh,
on the radio. So you do like 4 of those a night, and I think they paid us. I mean, it was like $15 or something,
mhm.
right? But it was fun, and it was a start. It kind of helped light that fire a little bit. But that was, I don't know, kind of a pre-social media thing in a way.
Mhm.
Citizen reporters, student reporters out there contributing content.
It's funny how I remember even my first blurbs in the Times uh didn't, a lot of them didn't have my name on them, but like I knew that like I wrote those 3 sentences,
That's me.
man, the effort that I put in to write 2 paragraphs was
Yeah, yeah.
it was a
Hey,
lot.
now you just dump it into AI, piece of cake, man.
Oh, I know. Which I not for other stuff I do a lot of AI. So it's great. And at the same time, it's definitely changed the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's some very scary elements to it. I'll tell you how I use it primarily for grammar,
Mhm. Yeah,
punctuation stuff, and I'm about
exactly.
ready to send something off, fix it. I'm usually pretty close, but it does help.
Yeah, and that's especially I don't have any editors and I hate typos, so um
Yeah,
I yeah. So but I know we are starting to run a little bit low on time. As I always say every week, I have the free version of Zoom because I'm not going to pay yet for until this is profitable, if ever. But I definitely want to say that you know doing those weekly updates we did
yeah,
at UW's when you were with Como, like that was, I really enjoyed that.
it
And
was
every
fun.
time I bumped into you at a press box, you're always so kind and so helpful. And that
Appreciate,
has always meant a lot. So,
I appreciate that.
part of this thing, this podcast is to thank people that have helped me along the way. So,
Well, thanks, man. Look, I'm always happy to help a Kelly. Your dad and I go way back. Think the world of his bride. But yeah, in fact, you and I talking reminds me. I got to get a hold of your dad because we haven't. It's been a while since we got together to have our bowls of oatmeal,
oh, right.
so we can fix all things in the world, sports and otherwise. So
Exactly. Yeah, those I've had many of those five spot
yes,
breakfast. Yes.
exactly. You gave away our secret location. Cup of Queen Anne, everybody. That's where you can find us on
Yeah,
occasion.
right. So, well, again, thank you so much. This has been great. I love those stories, and yeah, it's always nice to go. I love going into the way back and hearing
Yeah,
stories about magic and all that stuff. So,
yeah.
yeah, I really appreciate the time today.
Thanks, Mason. It was fun. I appreciate it. Good luck to you with everything you're doing now.